Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Kings, in which the Sharks managed to win 4-1. While the Sharks have been winning a lot recently, this is actually their first regulation win in over a couple of weeks, considering most of their wins recently have come in both overtime and the shootout. So nice to see the Sharks get a pretty solid 60-minute victory. And this was a pretty similar game, at least start to it, than the one previously against the Kings just a few days ago. Again, the Sharks came up to a sizable lead, but the big difference is that they did not allow the Kings to get so many chances to get back into this one as they did the other one. Once it was 4-0, the Sharks basically did not really give the Kings all that much until the Kings managed to find a goal and ruin the shutout here from Martin Jones in just the last couple of minutes of the third period. And so this first period started off, and it wasn't necessarily Sharks controlled. In fact, the Kings actually had a fair share of chances to get a goal, although Jones made a few good saves, and it would be the Sharks with the only 2 goals in the first from both Marleau and Vlasic. And interestingly enough, I commented on the power play in that game against the Jets, having scored 0 goals, going 0 for 6. It again had no goals on their attempts tonight, but technically Marleau's goal came just a few seconds after a power play expired, so you could say it was power play influenced. And Vlasic's, while not technically on the power play, was on a delayed penalty call against the Kings that gave the Sharks the 6-on-5 advantage. So while the power play itself still hasn't shown too much improvement, although I did see a couple things I liked this game, at least the Sharks did get some power play influenced goals. Then they would get Noah Gregor's first goal of his NHL career, as we saw him basically show off the main thing that we've actually seen from him in terms of skill set during the dozen or so games he's had played this season, which was his speed, as he zoomed past Walker to get this shot onto Quick and score. And then eventually Couture would make it 4-0, and as I said, Clifford late in the third would make it at least relatively respectable for the Kings and ruin a potential first shutout of the year for Jones. Speaking of Jones, the first thing I talk about will be this Sharks starting goaltender. He finds his way back in between the pipes after a pretty mediocre performance from Dell on Wednesday against the Winnipeg Jets, and Jones again puts up a solid performance against his former team, actually a very good performance. As I said, the Sharks were not necessarily dominant in the first period, and especially the early second period, the Kings were really pushing to try and get a goal to cut into the Sharks' lead, and Jones was making very good save after very good save. And so sadly, as I said, he loses the shutout at the end. He'll still be waiting for that one, but Jones has been very good in these past few games. I believe there was a stat this game where Jones is now tied, or was tied, for most wins for a Sharks goaltender in the month of November, and with this victory tonight, that puts him at 9 wins in November, which is the most for a Sharks goaltender in November of all time. So a nice little stat there for Martin Jones, who has shown some notable improvement this month. Next, I will talk about Tomas Hertl. The Sharks ended up going back to 12 forwards and 6 defensemen here tonight because Tomas Hertl did return to the lineup, and then eventually ended up leaving the lineup again. He played, I believe, a couple or so periods before he would not return out to play any more shifts. And maybe this was just precaution because the game was somewhat out of reach by the time Hertl was taken off the bench. But it is still somewhat worrying, of course, especially considering when Hertl was on the ice. It looked okay, but you could tell something was off. So I'm not entirely sure if it was re-aggravated or, again, just precautionary or something like that. But hopefully Hertl is not out that long term, as we saw the Sharks were able to get a bit more of a balanced attack here tonight, or I guess today. And if Hertl does find his way out of the lineup once again due to injury, and if it was re-aggravated and it maybe ends up being a bit more long-term, the Sharks could be in a bit of trouble. Next, I will talk about Suomela, a player who came into the Sharks lineup just a few games ago, and he has been okay. He hasn't been fantastic, but he has shown a few things that have kept him in the lineup for DeBoer night after night, even though DeBoer has seemingly not liked Suomela in the past. And he starts off pretty well in this game, but unfortunately he takes a massive hit from Kings defenseman McDermott and ends up heading out to the dressing room. This was pretty late in the third period. It ended up being called a major, but then with the Pavelski rule was reviewed back down to a minor penalty. Hopefully Suomela is okay, but it definitely didn't look all that pretty. It's not going to be a huge loss necessarily for the Sharks, but this was probably the first time in a while where a fourth line for the Sharks actually looked quite good, and I'm sure DeBoer was so excited to actually be able to go in to a game with the same fourth line, like go into another game in a row with the same fourth line and actually be happy with that performance. So unfortunately Suomela likely will be injured, but I guess anything could happen. even though it was a pretty solid game for himself. Finally, I will talk about the lineup here for the Sharks, because as I said, they did return to 12 forwards and 6 defensemen, but a few changes here or there. Now, before the Hertl injury occurred, what we saw was Kane, Couture with LeBanc, then it was Meier, Hertl with Goodrow, and it was, of course, Marleau, Sorensen, and Thornton. And those top 3 lines actually looked quite solid, but here tonight, interestingly enough, DeBoer decides not to go back with that and decides to put Goodrow on the first line with Kane and Couture, Marleau with Meier and Hertl, and reunite that third line we saw so much of last season with LeBanc, Sorensen, and Thornton. And this actually looked quite good. I liked Couture. I liked Goodrow with Couture and Kane. They had a few very good shifts. Marleau continued to impress, had a very strong first period. And of course, Sorensen, Thornton, and LeBanc seemingly have not really lost a step from where they were chemistry-wise last season. So another set of solid lines. Again, if Hertl is out with injury, it could really be pretty devastating here, because the Sharks really do seem to work real well when all 12 of their forwards are available to play, or at least I should say their main 9 forwards are available to play, because right now it does seem like they're working quite well, and it would be unfortunate to see Hertl go down once more. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow. They'll face off against the Arizona Coyotes, a team that has actually been very good this season. Going to be a very important divisional match. The Sharks do find themselves, at least at the moment, back in a playoff spot thanks to this victory. The Coyotes are a few points ahead of the San Jose Sharks, so if the Sharks really want to get more competitive in this Pacific Division and find themselves outside of the wild card spot and into a top 3 Pacific Division spot, it would start with a win here against their division rivals. Class dismissed.